Everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. Welcome to another episode of Campfire Philosophy with J. Aaron Simmons. And I am super stoked today because those of you who've been watching for a while and hanging out with me here, either on YouTube at Philosophy Before We Find Ourselves or on Substack at Philosophy in the Wild, will know that these very sporadic podcasts basically occur these days when I've got cool friends doing cool stuff. And I take the opportunity and the format to be able to talk with them and invite you all to join that conversation. So we are live streaming today. If you want to join the conversation, just drop in a comment wherever you're watching, and it will pop up on our side, and hopefully we can engage with you. If you're watching later, after it's been recorded, feel free to reach out to me, and I will do my best to respond, or any comment that you put on YouTube. Of course, I respond to every comment that I possibly can. So thanks so much for being with us. Today, I am joined by my very good friend, David Dault, who is a professor up at Loyola University in Chicago and is doing amazing stuff, has been a long time radio host up there in Chicago. So any of you living in the cold Midwest will probably know his voice from his radio show. And he's also been doing the kind of thing that all of we academics wish we could do, which is like publishing 2 books in a matter of I think 4 weeks or something insane. So his second book has just come out. His first book, The Accessorized Bible, is amazing. I highly recommend it. If you are one of the people who find bulletproof covers to Bibles very strange, and Bibles for people who enjoy garden gnomes, and Bibles that are designed for everyone whose last name begins with a Q, you've got to read The Accessorized Bible. Dault looks at all kinds of really interesting material theology, material scripture questions. It's fantastic. But his new book, The Covert Magisterium, is one that just came out. I cannot recommend it enough. And in fact, on the back of the cover, there is a little blurb from yours truly. And here's what I say about Dault's book. The best theology is prophetic. It doesn't just speak truth to power, but enacts truth as a lived challenge to the complacency of the powerful. This book is prophetic. If it doesn't wake you up and shake you into action, I just don't think you were paying attention. So, David, congrats on the new book. Thanks so much for joining me. It's wonderful to have you here on Campfire Philosophy.
Aaron, it is such a joy to be with you, and thank you for your many decades of friendship and for this opportunity. This is the first public conversation I've had about the new book, and I couldn't think of a person I would rather talk to than you. And I just quickly want to say to anybody who's watching, including I see in the comments, our mutual friend, Michael Paradiso-Michau, just welcome,
wonderful.
and thank you for being part of this conversation as well. But I'm looking forward to going wherever you want to take me, my friend.
Well, let's start off with the question that I ask to every one of the students that works with me on any extended project. So whether this be a person writing a dissertation or an undergrad writing a senior thesis, I always start when they say, I want to do this thing, by asking them, so what is the question to which this book is an answer?
Yeah, what a good starting point. And I will say, at first, the question to which this book was an answer was, I had a dissertation that I wanted to get published. But unfortunately, the dissertation was finished in 2009. And as a peer reviewer sort of helpfully figured out, as the process dragged on, and as we got into the 2020s, everything in the dissertation was largely out of date. And so I got a real honest pushback from a peer reviewer. And so I went back to the drawing board and kind of did a gut rehab with this book. So this book is not my dissertation, even though it has the same title as my dissertation. Right. And it is instead an attempt to, well, let me take 2 steps back. The dissertation was an attempt to kind of look at the materiality of Bibles. In the time that has elapsed since the dissertation was finished, that question has largely been addressed by some of my dear colleagues, such as James Biello up at Northwestern, Tim Beal at Case Western Reserve University, S.B. Rodriguez Plate at Hamilton College, Dory Parmenter. all of them have really looked at the materiality of Scripture, and Jim Watts up at Syracuse, and they have all really engaged with it very effectively in a way that I could only have imagined and hoped back in 2009. And so that opened up a space for me, and then that led me to be, well, now that I have this title, the Covert Magisterium, what do I mean by that now in the 2020s? And what does that mean for the church in the 2020s? And what I really came to understand was that I was talking more about the covert side and the magisterium side than I was about the Bible and the Scripture side now, because that space had been cleared and other scholars had dealt with the Scripture side. That opened space for me to talk about the dynamics of violence that I see in the church, and to try and speak in a way that was both analytic and, to use your word, prophetic. I'm grateful for that word, about how we might turn away from the temptation of violence in the church.
I think that's fantastic. And it is the case, when I read the book, that I was fascinated by the connections between those two aspects, right? So on the one hand, I think this book pairs very nicely with the Accessorized Bible in that they are both at some level asking the, rather clickbaity title that I used for this live stream, which is, what even is the Bible? Because that question gets asked materially in Accessorized Bible, but I think it gets asked hermeneutically or socially in this one. And so it seems to me that what the Covert Magisterium does as a book, but also as an invitation to the reader, is when we take up the Bible, it is too often understood as static, as stable, as just there for we Heideggerians, right? We think, well, it's just there. It presents itself. It's just given. And part of what you do, at least in the introduction, is say, this is especially a problem for Protestants who have long understood the Bible just being there, not to be a matter of materiality. My phone is there, my hand sanitizer is there. That's a matter of objective location, but there in the sense of available to understanding. And what I take you to be doing in this book is challenging the stability of what the Bible says as a matter of rupturing the complacency that would exist within the church or within society, such that, well, I read it this way, that's just what it says, the Bible says it, that settles it. And what I see you doing is saying, but wait a minute, what even is the Bible when you claim it says this or that? It's located in a context, in a history, in an interpretive community that has unfortunately gotten seduced by all kinds of, we might say, anti-Christian, anti-biblical influences like violence that now make the Bible hard to understand when we take it for granted as just there for us. Does that sound right?
Well, so first of all, I'm really pleased that you see these bridge points between Accessorized Bible and Covert Magisterium. One thing that I really think about in terms of how these books align and how these are lining up with later books that I'm currently conceiving and writing is Accessorized Bible is really designed to be a starting point. And it literally, in its conceit, it begins with the phrase, it's difficult to know where to begin, and it ends with the phrase, here is where I wish to begin. And so it really is a kind of table setting for the thinking that follows. And so Covert Magisterium is following in the wake of that book, trying to say, okay, now some space has been cleared on these material questions. And what are we going to do now with these other questions? And it's interesting to me that you declare that violence is anti-Christian. And that's not the move that I want to make. I very much want to affirm that there are people. I can walk down my block here in South Chicago, and I can walk past churches that are committed to violence as a kind of ideology. And by violence, I want to be clear to you and your listeners what I mean by that. I don't just mean hitting somebody over the head with a baseball bat. I'm really taking Ruth Wilson Gilmore's idea of violence. She says organized abandonment towards premature death. And so when we are finding ways to socially isolate people, when we're finding ways to physically isolate people, when we are finding ways to create division that gets in the way of abundance or solidarity, we are engaging in strategies of violence. And so it's a very capacious and maybe not a very usual definition of violence. But I think that that's important to us because we can find a lot of Christians that think that if we could just jail all the bad people, either in a temporal sense or in hell, then suddenly we would have paradise. And so I think we have a lot of Christians that are engaged in a project of violence. And that doesn't mean that they're outside the pale of being Christians. It just means that they have a particular materialization of Christianity that's very historic and is very popular. And I'm trying to present a different materialization of Christianity, not because I think that somehow it is essential or better, or that it precludes the possibility of violence, but rather, given the ambient violence that we are in, and Jesus's call to maybe lay down our swords and to love our neighbor and even our enemies, can we conceive of a different way of materializing our relationships with each other that don't fall into these patterns of organized abandonment and isolation? And the invitation for that really comes to me as a Catholic from Pope Francis when he says, we're done with the church of the second millennium. Now we are working towards the church of the third millennium. I took that as an overture and an invitation to begin to think in these ways.
That's fascinating. So maybe I would say, and anybody listening, just in case you don't know my work well, I am not a theologian. As my friend David Dault has reminded me many times in our relationship, I'm a philosopher. And so the stakes between philosophy and theology are often shared, though the ways things get worked out are often slightly different, right? So maybe a more precise way to put it would be, what role do you take? We'll come back to what then is this covert magisterium in a minute, but I want to know, what role do you take the Bible to play in the at least seeming increase of what my friend John Sanders refers to as authoritative models of God that are now getting aligned with authoritarian models of political and social power? What role do you take the Bible to play in justifying those commitments among those who appeal to the Bible to make them?
This is an excellent question. And so I'm going to hop, skip, jump back to Accessorized Bible, where I deal with this question extensively. A Bible is a book. And at the end of the day, and this is where I step out from being a theologian and I start LARPing as a philosopher. So you'll have to excuse me and push back.
Come on into the leper colony, my friend.
Yeah, I love it. But so we, and that the title Accessorized Bible is a kind of, it goes in a dual sort of direction. One is, as you've already said in your kind introduction, the notion of a Bible that kind of fits my wardrobe or fits my lifestyle. That's one type of accessorization. But I also think of a Bible in terms of how it becomes an accessory to our crimes, to the violence that we do to one another, and it sort of stands as giving us the thumbs up when we decide that people can't go to certain bathrooms or that they can't participate in certain, social goods. And so I try to really run down the question in Accessorized Bible of where is that decision coming from? And we tend to parasocially imagine that a Bible is an object that wants something from us and has definite opinions about how we live our lives. And because I am a nominalist and because I am an anti-metaphysicalist, an anti-Platonist, all those sorts of things, because I am trying to be very concretely material in the way that I think about these things, I want to insist that a Bible has no opinion because a Bible is an object, and objects don't get a say in what humans do. And so I really prefer instead to say that when a person is saying the Bible told me to kill this person, the Bible told me to exclude this person, that's a moral problem for the person.
Mm.
And the way that I give an example of this in Accessorized Bible is I use an example from the 1979 movie The Jerk with Steve Martin.
Fantastic.
And there's a scene in The Jerk where Steve Martin gets very excited, his character Navin Johnson, because his name is in the telephone book and he feels like he's arrived because he's in the telephone book. And then in the next scene, we're in an interior shot and you look over somebody's shoulder and you see he's got that same phone book open and he drops his finger on a page and it drops on Navin Johnson's name and he goes, "Die, Navin R. Johnson." And then in the next scene, he's shooting a gun trying to kill Navin Johnson.
Yeah.
And so we could say, well, the telephone book told him to kill Navin Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
That's a sociopathic way of reading because the book didn't do anything. It's all in the character's mind, and in the credits, the character is referred to as the madman. But I would say we sane people do this all the time as well. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. No, other people told you so. The Bible is a book. It doesn't speak. And it is a mute object. And so I want to be very careful about these categories. We are humans making decisions about the thriving and flourishing or the exclusion and death of other human beings. And we need to own that morally and socially.
Yeah. So this is where I think the let's do this just for our Protestant brethren and sisterin who may have no idea even what the magisterium is.
Welcome, heretics. Come on in.
The water is hot. So explain just Theology 101. What is the magisterium such that the adjective covert is doing work to change the focus, right? What is that? And then let's move into, so what then are you talking about?
Sure. So the way that I get at this in the book, Covert Magisterium, is I say, listen, on my table, there are two books. One is the Golfer's Bible, and it is from the Holman Christian Bible Publishers. It has the 66 books of the Protestant Bible in it. And you open it up and you can get the Psalms and you can get the Sermon on the Mount and you can get all the things that you expect. And around it, it's kind of wrapped with some inspirational quotes from Jack Nicklaus, and it's got some good golf-related pictures in it and things like that. But it's a Bible that you could take into worship anywhere that you would wish. And also on my table, I have another book called the Golfer's Bible. It's published by the Professional Golfers Association, and it doesn't contain the Psalms and it doesn't contain the Sermon on the Mount. But it, like the previous one, it has a lot of nice pictures and it's got some good inspirational quotes from Jack Nicklaus. And so part of what I ask is, okay, one of these would be, forgive me, kosher to take into Christian worship, and the other would not be kosher to take into Christian worship. What is it that's making that difference? And for want of a better term, the magisterium is the official organ of a church or a denomination that helps to determine those differences. This is scripture that is acceptable, or this is a Bible that is acceptable as scripture. And this book, even though it says Bible, will not be acceptable as scripture. So your Protestant listeners may know that their Bibles have 66 books, and they may not know, and they may be surprised to learn that the Catholic Bibles have 73 books. Some Orthodox Bibles have 78 books, and some Ethiopian and Coptic Bibles have in excess of 80 books. Okay, and so the question is, could you take one of those kinds of Bibles into a Protestant worship service, open up one of the books that's not in the 66 books of the Protestant Bible, and start preaching from the pulpit with it? Well, no, you couldn't. And when you ask why, now you're asking a magisterial question. It is that operating system that sits in the background and helps to determine what syntax is good syntax for the program and what constitutes a syntax error. And sometimes, as in the Catholic example, you have an absolute sort of visible office that declares itself and says, we're the magisterium. But in Protestant times, often, it's not a defined office, but rather it might be an individual pastor, or it might be the vestry, or it might be like there are different ways that this sort of operates. But whether in a formal or in a practical sense, every community has a norming mechanism that says some types of books are allowed to be read and some books are not in this way, and that acts in a kind of magisterial function. And if I haven't been clear on any of those points, please push back and invite me to clarify more, because I want to make sure that you and your listeners get this part as clearly as possible.
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense. I mean, so the way I tend to think about this is at every stage in every community, there are going to be certain um, assumptions about what can be allowed, what can be acceptable, and what can't. So when I was growing up, and so we'll take an example of how this idea of the magisterium, of course, playing out in a ridiculous way, illustrates it playing out in a very serious way. When I was growing up, on Sunday, you did not wear shorts to church. This was absolutely disrespectful. You wear your Sunday's best, right? If fans of Lecrae know, his church clothes album, there's a reason that we even have a discourse about church clothes. And where then is that work being done to decide what is or is not appropriate? And appropriateness judgments are rarely, and this is the difference, I think, or at least one of the differences between the structure of norms in lots of Protestantism versus the structure of norms in lots of Catholicism. These appropriate norms are very, very often hidden in Protestant communities. And the reason that they are hidden, I think, my at least take as a philosopher, kind of a hermeneutic interpretive gesture, I think there's two reasons for this. One is because ideology only works well when it is invisible.
Yeah.
And the way to think about this is if you had to explain why we do what we do in rational ways that could meet the objections of the stranger, what you've now done is recognized there are a whole bunch of ways we could have done this, but we've landed here. That's not a very effective way of circling the wagons around the obvious rightness of your community's behavior. It has to be, we do this because this is the right thing to do. We do this because this is what we do. And that self-referential justification is what I would describe as the kind of invisible power of the magisterium in these spaces, right? Now, the second reason is it's not just hidden because it works better when it's hidden. It's also hidden because the power structure of the Protestant community, the pastor, the council, the staff, whatever the community looks like, often doesn't know this is happening. Right? So it's not just that it's this strategic attempt to keep things under wraps. It's that they have largely trained themselves and been trained into their power by acting as if this work doesn't occur. And the way this often plays out, I think, is when, for example, I was in Sunday school growing up, and I grew up Church of God Pentecostal traditions. Never once, ever do I remember being told, how many books does the Protestant Bible have?
Right.
It was, how many books does the Bible have? Right?
Yep.
And I don't think my pastors in general, or my Sunday school teachers, or the council, or whoever, I don't think it ever occurred to most of them that that distinction even existed. There's just the Bible, right? So the invisibility of the interpretive assumptions, which then reflects a power structure, is often so invisible that the actual power structure doesn't see the workings of its own power. And that, I think, can be insidious when then we run into social circumstances like, how then should we understand ICE raids as a theological question? How should we understand what's going on in Gaza as a question that maybe we would turn to the Bible to help us understand? How do we make sense of the power of Caesar or Trump in the context of particular assumptions about this book counting as authoritative for our lives, right? And unless we are clear about the working of that power, we aren't sure where then to press as critics of it because we don't think it actually exists. So, in some ways, and don't go too far with this, my Catholic friend, I find Catholicism to be way better than Protestants on this particular point because the explicit recognition of the history of power working to then understand what we will let count as legitimate, authoritative, or acceptable.
So, first of all, what a beautiful, generous read, and I agree with everything that you've said, with one material distinction. Every place in your last 5 minutes where you use the term power, I would substitute the term violence, because using a distinction that I draw from Hannah Arendt and I talk about extensively in the beginning of the book. I really do see power and violence as a dyad. I'm not a Foucauldian on this front. And so I don't see power as this kind of neutral thing that can go in either a violent direction or a more sort of positive direction. Power is people working together to build things that they need without coercing each other. And they're moving towards what Hannah Arendt would call a natal future, an open future, rather than an economic or a closed future, a sort of known and predicted future. That would be the quibble that I would have with the language of power in what you're saying. But everything else in what you're saying is exactly correct. And the example that I go to a lot is I have over on my bookshelf the Stewardship Study Bible, which is published by, I believe, Tyndale House and endorsed by, among others, Dave Ramsey, the financial guru. But if you go to Acts 5, and it's a study Bible, you go to Acts 5, and for those that haven't read the book of Acts lately, Acts 5 is where you hear that the Christian community shared all things in common and no one was in want, but instead everyone received according to their need and everyone gave according to their ability, which is the foundation of where the Fabian socialists got that. And then Karl Marx picks this up into his materialist socialism. But so here we have this wonderful example of Christian communism, so important to the community that in the next few verses, when Ananias and Sapphira break the call to be communists with one another, they are literally struck down by lightning and killed by God. Okay. If you go to the footnote on that page in the Stewardship Study Bible, it begins with the line, "This form of community was not communism because," and it goes on to say it's voluntary and whatever. And so it's taking the idea that is plainly in the language on the page, and it is reading a meaning into it, which is, if you will, contra the plain sense of what's on the page. It would be like going to Psalm 137, where it says, "We won't be happy until we take the babies of our enemies and dash their heads against the rocks," and say, "This was a wonderful way to have a garden party." I mean, so that would be, for me, an example of a very Protestant version of a covert magisterium, where we have editors who are acting in the background saying, what you're reading plainly on the page, that's not what it means. It means this. And so
these are not the words you are looking for.
Kind of a Jedi mind trick, exactly. And you know, what does that do when we hear, for example, Jesus saying things like, "Love your enemy and bless those who curse you. And if someone asks something of you, to go a mile, go an extra mile. And if someone asks your cloak, give all your garments," or what have you. And then we have sort of armchair magisterial interpreters like J.D. Vance saying, you know, this is empathy and that's toxic. You know, and so we can see examples all over the place of these kinds of magisterial moments. And as you have rightly pointed out, many of them are covert. They are not announcing themselves in that way.
I think that's right. I mean, it's fascinating to me. I think there's two general spaces that we are then kind of opening onto that help us understand what this covert part is, right? I remember when you came up with this title back in grad school. For those of you who don't know, David and I were colleagues at Vanderbilt University years ago. I was in philosophy, he was over in theology, and then we would do silly things like, I would take theology classes, he would take philosophy classes, and then we would just annoy our professors respectively when we had crossed those lines, right? But covert is kind of like radical. It's a word that immediately sounds sexy, right? So covert magisterium makes it sound like, ooh, this is spy games. This is, really something that's sneaky. I'm letting a secret out that people won't know about. But I actually think this is in many ways maybe one of the most mundane, plain sense terms you could possibly use, because what is covert is the very fact that the magisterium is, right? The magisterium, I mean, you talk in the book about the history of textuality, the history of interpretation, all these decisions occurring relative to translations. But the very fact that all of those different things are spaces where either the workings of power or the workings of violence, depending on how we make sense of this, that by itself is revelatory in ways that I think the vast majority of, and here I'll be a little narrower, the vast majority of predominantly white American evangelicalism has been defined by denying. It cannot allow that any of those layers exist, because then it requires the the new clothes of the emperor to be exposed for what they are. And what I mean by that is, in, again, predominantly white American evangelicalism, which there's even more caveats that would be necessary, but for the sake of time, we'll just use that one. I used to just say predominantly white evangelicalism, and then my British friends were like, yo, like, you're throwing us under the bus. We're not at all as crazy as you guys, right? But part of what happens is there is inherent in that tradition, and I think people like Nathan Hatch and others have really unpacked a lot of this, there is such a deep sense of individualism that the idea that there is this behind the scenes workings handing over to you things that then you take up, you think, as free decisions, but they've already been so filtered that now your decisions may make no difference, right? Because we've only handed you the two menu options that then necessitate landing in a particular space. So the reason I think so much of this has to be covert, it has to be under the scenes, is because it would necessitate that individualism is itself maybe a kind of idolatry, right? Or at least a very particular social and cultural inheritance that has been bequeathed as theological doctrine. Does that make sense? I mean, I know you don't go in quite that direction in the book, but I think you're certainly playing at those edges.
Well, yeah, and I think you are correct that oftentimes what we would call magisterial structures find it very efficient to operate in a covert manner. And this is why the covert magisterium that comes up at the end, that chapter sort of analyzing that idea, is kind of coupled with the final chapter, which is talking about a magisterium that is based more on the Catholic idea of synodality. And we can talk about synodality in a moment. But the examples of covert operation that sort of arise in the book, I talk about two theologians from the Catholic tradition, both women, both sort of considered to be sort of feminist theologians. One is Elizabeth Johnson, and the other is Ana Maria Isasi Diaz, unfortunately the late Muirista theologian. And in both cases, in Elizabeth Johnson's case, she writes a book, and the USCCB, the Council of Bishops here in America, has immediately before she puts out this book, they have they have put out a document that says, here's how we're going to argue and disagree with theologians. Yeah. And then she has the experience of being called sort of before this body about the book, has to say again and again, you've already defined how you're going to interact with me. Why aren't you interacting this way? You haven't read my book. You're not engaging with the responses that I'm giving you. Instead, you're sort of creating a theater where there's already a decision, but you're asking us all to play as if we have participated in the process. So that's one example of what I would call a covert magisterium, where a decision is already made, and yet there's the necessity of the theater of the decision. Even though a written document, a written procedure is there, it's not followed. And for those that have ever worked on a nonprofit or any kind of board of directors, you know that something toxic creeps in when a board of directors sits and has a meeting run by Robert's Rules of Order, but the real decisions are made by three guys out in the parking lot. That's
and for those of us at those of us at universities, right? This is what university administrators call listening sessions.
Yes,
and it's like I have yet to see listening sessions where listening led to transformed views. Mm-hmm. It's more, notice how this then looks like it's the theater of collaborative discourse.
Yeah,
but in fact, it then allows less heat to come when authoritarian decisions are passed downwards, right? And that's, I think, the thing that is just so fascinating about your book is from the beginning to the end, there is a personal, affective, felt quality that is anchored in lots of first personal stories from a range of, in my tradition, we would call the cloud of witnesses from whom you draw. And they are all about the ways in which violence plays out as structurally complicit with the way we make sense of, quote unquote, just being good Bible believing Christians, right? And how is it that you have, or maybe ask you, what is the hope you have for the reader who picks up this book, who, let's say, finds themselves, whether in the Catholic context you just described, where now they are maybe at odds with the decision-making explicit mechanism that yet is doing stuff behind the scenes, or what about in the more Protestant space, where, and again, this of course would work in any religious context. I would say it would work in any community that has authority structures built into decision-making, right? But explicitly in Protestant spaces, what is your hope for the reader who then finds themselves convinced by what you are saying? Are you worried that this might ask more of them than they are prepared to do? Because now it's not just, oh, I read Acts 5 differently. It might be, I now can no longer be part of what I have taken to be my entire social community, right? Like, that's what I meant by the prophetic dimension, is this is a call to radical being at odds with the structure that we long have taken for granted as obvious. What is your hope for that reader if that might be one of the outcomes?
So I had a breakdown in the middle of writing this book, and that gets recorded on the page when I talk about kind of carceral Catholicism and the carceral magisterium, and the way that I end up talking about this throughout the book and in the wrapping of the book, in the preface, is I refer to it as a hopeless hope. Yeah. And I get this in part from a wonderful thinker out in Colorado by the name of Miguel de la Torre. And he wrote a book a few years ago called Embracing Hopelessness that continues to torment me. It torments me in the best possible way. But what I am aware of is that any hope that I could offer, and this gets back to your observation that we are conditioned to certain, A and B choices. Like if I go to someone who is reporting to me that their life is not functional because of the way that the church has arrayed itself in social space, like I can't go to the bathroom here in America as who I am because the church has lobbied so, or I can't love who I want to love, and in fact, if I'm in Uganda, I will be killed because the church has gone over there and has lobbied with the government to make basically lethal structures of exclusion over there. Okay, if I bring my white male cis presenting het presenting hope into that, that's going to be a hope that is conditioned where I'm the main character of the story and my comfort gets kind of preserved and reproduced. And we're reforming around the edges at best, but at the end of the day, things will not change fundamentally for this person. The language that gets used that I borrow from Pope Francis is the people beyond the streetlights. Okay. And so I'm convicted by James Baldwin when James Baldwin says, listen, as an African-American man, he says a black man because he's writing in the 60s, if I'm going to go into a white Christian church and be accepted as a Christian, the church itself will have had to have changed.
That's right.
And so, whatever hope that I have is not a hope that has a shape. Because any shape that I would dictate would already be an economic, predictive, kind of future-oriented kind of narrative where, again, I get to know that I will be okay. Whereas instead, the kind of hope that I would have would be a catastrophic hope. To quote those great moral theologians, the dead Kennedys, the stars and stripes of corruption, let's bring it all down. That would be the hope here for the people beyond the streetlights, because nothing that we could reproduce, you and I, would look good for them. It would only look good for us. And so I have to abandon the idea that I'm going to be safe in the hope that I have.
Yeah. I mean, and this is powerful because one of the things that so you and I haven't actually talked about this just as friends, but about a year ago, it became clear to me that I could no longer go to the kinds of churches that I still feel deeply, deeply, deeply connected to as a matter of heritage, legacy, familial loyalty, all kinds of stuff. Even, let's be honest, at the level of like affective preference, right? I'm Pentecostal. I grew up playing drums, was a session drummer for a long time, as you know. For me, I mean, if you're not running during church and eating spaghetti immediately afterwards, I don't see the point. So you should understand, I am like the furthest from high liturgy a person could get. I think the only organ that should ever be at a church service is a Hammond B3, and it should play the entire time, by the way, right? Behind the pastor. So this reality is something that really matters to me. I grew up here. I'm fourth generation Pentecostal. This is my grandfather was a Pentecostal preacher. My uncle was a Pentecostal evangelist. Like, these aren't just passing things. Oh, it was down the street. That's where we went, right? I can't go there anymore. Not because I no longer am Pentecostal, not because that tradition is one I can't find myself in, but because I can't find the contemporary churches in that tradition. They seem to have been so willing to allow themselves to buy a particular narrative that people like Randall Balmer and others have really rigorously traced as emerging as a very particular response to equal rights amendments and civil rights legislation and the reactions to the Vietnam War and the frustration with Jimmy Carter's seeming support for the hippies. Like, all of that stuff changed the theology that gets taken for granted. It changed how the magisterium presents itself in these spaces. And for a long time, I had the view, which was, we like Socrates. These are the laws that constituted us. These are my parents. They brought me up here. I can't change if I'm not part of. Even Bonhoeffer has very different context, but has that lovely line where he says, I cannot be part of the transformation and recovery afterwards if I was not part of the suffering now, right? So I really, really held on to that until, and to make it, not to put a fine point, we are very good at fine points, until Trump got reelected at 81% electoral choices by these people. And it was like, look, now this is not even the whiff of the moral vision I was raised to believe is part of my Christianity. This is so far from anything that has been handed me as biblically committed. I just can't let my son be in spaces where people aren't acknowledging that. And so we have now shifted to a church that has wonderful pastors. I highly recommend them. They're amazing. But it sounds and feels like an NPR fundraising campaign, and their organ is the only instrument, and it's got like 70,000 pipes that circle the whole thing. And I genuinely can't stand it. But it's a theological vision that still resonates with the radical Pentecostal tradition that said justice for the widow, the orphan, the stranger, that the prophetic history that says love justice, enact mercy, and walk humbly. Like, these things are true here. The problem is, and there's a question at the end of this sentence, the problem is this church has all kinds of problems too, right? Like it is overwhelmingly white, despite being affirming, despite loving racial justice and speaking in favor of this and working in the community to enact it. I'm not actually sure the Sunday morning services are hospitable if you don't have, pews that your grandfather grew up on, right? Like, the reality is there isn't underneath all this stuff some sort of, oh, now we've figured out the purity. Now we've got it right. Now the Bible is on our side. What you lose when you understand the working of the Covert Magisterium is, crap. Smugness is now no longer within our wheelhouse. And that's what I love about your answer, to say, it's not my role to hope, right? Because in doing that, it acts as if I've got the vision handled. And at the end of the day, all we've got is the best we can do where we are. And as Bonhoeffer says, I pray God forgive me, right? There can't be some sort of, now we know what the Bible really says. It's just, no, is this Bible one I'm willing to raise my son in light of? And it turns out I was no longer willing to do that in the churches that I care so deeply about, because the Bible and the Jesus and the God and the account they were offering was one that was okay with violence not being a problem, so long as it cut in their favor. And that's a thing I'm not okay with anymore, right? But as Jimmy Barker puts in the comments, all of these are American dreams, all of which are American dreams, right? The Rage Against the Machine prophetic voice comes back around, because it's far too easy to let your and I's version of the American dream just now be the better biblical vision, rather than recognizing it too is a product of all kinds of covert workings that we have to do our best to be humble enough to say, what are the voices that are being excluded? How can I invite hospitality to the critics of where I find myself? How is it that you think synods offer a better way forward given that problem?
First of all, I love hearing you talk, and second of all, I'm grateful that Jimmy Barker is in this conversation. Readers of the Accessorized Bible will know that Jimmy shows up in that book, in the early part of the book, but also a line that that Jimmy said years and years and years ago when we were in graduate school together. Again, a dear friend to us both. He sort of just said at one point, I sometimes teach to my students, the Bible says that slavery is okay, and the Bible says that being homosexual is is not allowed. And he sort of presents this to the students of, like, what are we going to do with that when that's the plain sense of the text?
Yeah.
And I am thinking about that in light of everything that you have been saying, because the day after the election, my wife and I went on a long walk, and my wife Kira basically said, "I'm done. I can't be part of a church that overwhelmingly brought this reality into." And so this is something that we are dealing with as a family as well. Like, where is our home now?
Well,
And so,
what's so important right there, though, just so that no one misunderstands,
yeah,
you and I are not saying down with conservatism.
no,
It might be right. It
yeah,
might actually have the better vision for how we go forward. It's a matter of saying, this guy, this account, right? So it's not a matter of suggesting, if you're really a Christian, you are a progressive like us.
yeah.
The point is, if you're willing to side with this instantiation of a thing, I no longer know how to recognize you as part of the community concerned with the values we have claimed to care about.
And
right?
I would take that up, but I would say it in a slightly different way, although I definitely see how you're construing it. How I talk about it in the book is, there is a carceral project in Christianity. There is the mindset that says, if we could just jail the right people,
Yeah.
all of this would be solved. And again, it's either an eternal jail or it is a temporal jail. But either way, we find the justification to say, this will be solved if X people are no longer part of the public sphere.
Right.
And what I suggest late in the book is, we've had 2,000 years to see how that experiment has worked.
Mm.
And has it actually brought us the blessed kingdom that it promised? And the answer is unequivocally no.
Yeah.
And doubling down on it, because now we have the turbocharged version of it, or we have the drone-backed version of it, or we have the Palantir, operated version of it. We still are chasing this idea that if we could just get the right cage and get the right people in the cages, then everything would be fine.
Yeah.
And that is what crucified Jesus.
Right.
And so my suggestion is that this is the second millennium to third millennium invitation of Pope Francis. There's a different church awaiting us to be materialized. And it's not that we get the perfect church out of it, but we get a different mechanism of being with one another out of it. And in the same way that Covert Magisterium sort of says, okay, now I'm going to begin the project. The Accessorized Bible ends with saying, I'm now going to begin the project. Covert Magisterium ends with saying, what this looks like is synodality. And I do it in broad strokes, but I don't really flesh it out. And so synodality basically is listening. And it is listening, especially when we're very, very good right now because we love meetings that yield planned futures. We have an agenda and we know who's going to talk. And we know at the end of the day, when we call for a new business, nobody is going to shout from the rafters, hey, I can't eat. We've got to. And so we know that everything's going to be decent and in order and decorum. And our agenda is going to maintain that for us. And synodality begins as soon as somebody shouts from the rafters, hey, I can't eat. And I'm not on the agenda. I can't get on the agenda, but I need you to respond.
Yeah.
And you might think, okay, the church could never operate that way. And I don't talk about this much in this book, but in the project that I'm working on right now, which is trying to think about synodality, moving towards solidarity, I talk about this at some length. And that is, in the 1980s, the Toyota management system. You didn't imagine this coming from a theologian, did you? The Toyota management system had something called the JIDCO method, which started back in the 1890s. A big automated loom, and they would be sort of weaving things together. But if a string broke, one of the threads broke in the loom, immediately the mechanism would stop.
Interesting.
And they would go and they would fix it. And then that in the 1980s became what they called the andon cord, which on the factory floor, if anybody from the highest official to the lowest worker to the janitor saw something that was wrong, they could pull this cord and then suddenly everything would stop and all the people would descend on the thing so that they didn't reproduce the problem. Wow. And they made sure that they didn't build the problem into their reproduction cycle for the next iteration and the next iteration. They fixed it where it was. Imagine if there was something like that in the church where somebody could say, I can't survive. I'm not flourishing. I don't have abundant life. I'm dying. And the church would stop everything until that person was made safe.
Yeah.
And that to me is, in the broadest strokes, what the structure of the church of the third millennium would look like. But what does that look like in terms of policies, in terms of practicalities? I think we get into dangerous territory if I start saying what is and is not the proper policy to enact that. I think it begins by the simple act of being willing to be interrupted from my important business. This is, if we think about, Jesus walking with Jairus to go save Jairus's daughter, and suddenly Jesus stops in the middle of it and says, "Somebody touched me." And Jairus is saying, "What the heck are you talking about, man? We got important business here. My daughter's dying, and I'm the most important person in town. You need to come with me right now." And Jesus says, "No, no, no." Jesus allows himself to be interrupted in that moment.
Yeah.
And that interruption, I think, is the synodal thing that we're talking about. That's where somebody's saying, "I've been trying for 12 years and I can't figure out how to live. And can you help me?" And a willingness, the church, to stop and still, to bring life both to the daughter and to this woman who has been cast out. That's the grand project. That's what we can have hope in. We know that Jesus was able to accomplish it. We seem for 2,000 years to be really bad at it. We need to learn to be interrupted and to listen. I don't know if that begins to help to answer the question, but that's where I'm going with all this.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, I think from synodality to solidarity is a great future space coming out of Covert Magisterium, because if we see the accessorized Bible as, so what is this thing and how does this thing work? We see the Covert Magisterium as the second half of that question. So what then is the Bible? And the answer is a complicated thing resulting from an enormously subtle, sometimes invisible, and almost always violent historical process.
Yeah.
So what then do we do? Those of us who might especially find the Bible to be some thing to which we appeal for how to live, right? And that's where I find your work powerful and important. And yet I also find, as a philosopher, theology so frustrating, to be honest. And the reason I find it so frustrating is because I have said for 25, 30 years, and I still hold this view, I've written a lot about it, that the difference between philosophy and theology is the immediacy of the evidence to which the discourses can appeal. I think philosophy can only appeal immediately without argument to evidence that is in principle accessible to all members of the philosophical community. I'm a public reason guy. I did not used to be. That is a shift in my thinking, largely as a result of just seeing abuses of religious reasons in public discourse. Theology, though, I hold differently. And it's in part because of the workings of the magisterium being different there than in something like the Guild of Philosophy. I think theology does not have to appeal to evidence that is immediately available in principle to all members of the theological guild. Instead, it has another authority structure, which is you, for example, as, let's say, a Catholic theologian, are not obligated to be speaking in a way that is recognizing the authority structures of a Protestant religious community. In the same way that I would not recognize a Muslim theologian having to speak in a way where the evidence appealed to would be granted immediately by the Catholic theologian. That you all work in traditions and discourses that are also anchored in historical religious communities, or more precisely, cultural communities that have been labeled religious. And that's, I think, the way it should be, right? You should be able to appeal to something called the Bible as evidential in a way that I, as philosopher, cannot. My question, though, about that fact, so how does the synod then work? You're at the synod, or you're at the space, and somebody says, look, all fine and good, I like the pipe organ, but guys, I don't have health care, right? lovely. I'm glad that we are going out of our way to celebrate, Man Weekend or whatever. But that doesn't make sense of the fact that, if I find myself in a, gay marriage, well, do we both come to or are we not really invited? And that's what the gender split is already doing here, right? Is this really exclusion, not welcome and solidarity? Like, when those questions get raised, my worry is the workings of the authority structures called the Bible get deployed so immediately that, in fact, there's no way to then break through, given the social and political framing that those structures have now been allowed to have. So, in other words, I'm at a church, say, and someone says, but I don't have health care. And I stand up and say, and that's a problem. We've got to solve that before we go forward. Someone else can just respond, but you're not reading the Bible correctly. And, oh, you're a progressive. We need you to leave, right? So as you know, I've been asked to leave a number of churches because I simply would ask questions and interrogate the obviousness of the way the Bible was being allowed to work. And my thought here is, but doesn't theology have intractably that problem, which is you wacko, radical, progressive theologian, you're just wrong. And this is why we then have our own schools where we will train our theologians to know what the Bible really is, right? And the problem becomes they can and should appeal to those internal structures of authority in order to speak into the church where they find themselves. But doesn't that create a kind of insularity and self-protective overlay that might be almost like, I don't know how we break that, because I do know how you do it in philosophy. But the whole point is, this is why philosophers are pretty often anathema at churches, right? So I don't know if that makes sense, but like I'm wondering, in that synod, the question is raised and somebody just responds, hey, not our problem. The poor you'll have with you always. Go get a job, bum. Back to the work of the church, which is standing against the gay agenda, right? Like, how is it that the interruption interrupts when Jesus, as it were, would be escorted out the back as one of those empathy woke radicals, and yet internal to the way theology works, it doesn't have to open itself up beyond that authority structure where it is located?
So two immediate thoughts come to mind, and one is Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who I've mentioned earlier. She's the abolition geographer from whom I take this definition of violence as organized abandonment that aims at premature death. She has a phrase that she uses almost like a mantra. She says, in communities where life is precious, life is precious. And so it's not something that you can impose. It is a kind of value that has to come from a relational commitment to the others around you. And if the only way that you think about your relational commitment to the others around you is instrumental, kind of like a car salesman, I'm here to get whatever I can out of these people, then you're never going to break through to that. And so this is the kind of question of like, how do we shift the gears so that a person is not looking at me just as a means to an end, but rather as an end in myself? This is the fundamental Kantian question. Right. But the other piece of this comes from Ursula K. Le Guin, and she says, you cannot make revolution. You can only act in revolutionary ways. And so I'm trying with my writing and my thinking here not to come up with a kind of grand teleological design for when everything's going to be perfect and violence will end. I take Judith Butler very seriously when they say we are in ambient violence. It's always going to be a matter of someone is interpreting and saying this is not working for me. Right. And so when someone is being cared for in that church situation, in your hypothetical, someone in the back of the church is going to interrupt and saying, you're wasting resources on this bum. Okay, so there's going to be an endlessly negotiative and interpretive and interruptive process here, which looks very different from the kind of efficiency that we're used to wanting in our social spaces. But then I go to Pope John Paul II and a document that he promulgated called Evangelium Vitae. In paragraph 12 of Evangelium Vitae, he says there's a culture of life and a culture of death. And the marks of the culture of death are that when someone interrupts us, and I'm paraphrasing, but when someone interrupts us, we instead appeal to our comfort and we say, this person is the enemy of my comfort. And he says that the main way that we accomplish maintaining our comfort is through efficiency. And so we tend to think about the way, every way that we means test and we organize society right now is not part of the third millennial church. It is part of the second millennium church. And everything that we have incorporated into the church structure to say we got to run it like a business and we have to be good stewards of our resources, and it's not loaves and fishes, it is, you know, counting the talents and whatever. Like, all of that is going to mean that it is the most logical thing to make sure that certain people starve.
Yeah.
And that's the trap that we get caught in again and again.
So let me appeal to your prophetic depth, my friend. And this goes back to the, as you put it so astutely, you know, what counts as home to your wife and you, right? In light of this. So when does one walk away from the church as the only way of entering into the synodality of the third millennial church? In other words, I think we're watching right now a space that I do a lot of, a space where I find an audience that seems to resonate with a lot of my work, though in many ways I have often found it perplexing, is the deconstruction space, right? The ex-evangelical, the, you know, no longer find ourselves there. And part of why I find it perplexing is just because I've never actually deconstructed from the faith. I've just, I think, evolved in what the faith means and how it plays out for me in my space. And I also don't have the religious trauma that is very real for so many in that community. My background and my experiences are largely, not exclusively, you know, healthy and life-giving. The problem is, those experiences are part of what then again continue to be a kind of gravitational pull to why I think maybe we have to stay within and keep working for what this could be. And yet I see thousands and thousands, if not millions, of people that are just saying, no, I'm out. What is it that, like, it seems to me, who is it? Pete Rollins had that book years ago called The Fidelity of Betrayal. And I'm wondering, hearing you talk, like, is the prophetic move then to say the only way to stand for something like the version of Christ that one would find from the version of the Bible that we take seriously is no longer to participate in what the church now looks like, because it is a second millennial church? Like, is that break necessary? I don't know what that would mean. And I think you're the right person because you are so faithful to the importance of the church, but you are faithful to the justice to which we are called internal to the church, which then causes us to be critics of the church. When do we walk away?
So I used to say that if I could imagine a church that was better than the church that actually existed, that was fundamentally the logic of Protestantism. And I have resisted, as a Catholic, allowing myself to sort of say, where's the better church? As a materialist, I want very much to deal with the really existing church as it is. But I have been struggling with that mantra that I have imposed upon myself lately, because I am thinking about exactly the questions that you are asking me. And the way that I try and talk about it in Covert Magisterium is I suggest that there is a carceral church, and counterpoise to a carceral church, I talk about an abolitionist church. And I try and talk about this in very simple material terms, a church that wants people in cages as a solution to the problem, and a church that says letting people out of cages and even abolishing cages altogether is the solution to the problem. And so this abolitionist church, to the extent that it can actually be about a liberative project, it is moving in a direction that is going to demand that it not impose its beliefs on people, but rather it is listening to people, because you can't just go into a community and get rid of all the jails. Right. Like that, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is an abolitionist, would say, that's not the way that we go. We don't say we're going to knock something down. We say, these resources that have been used to build these cages, what could we use these resources for? And how can we make sure that we're building a flourishing community, not by taking something away, but by repurposing the things that we have put into this, service of death into a service of life? Yeah. Okay. And so the suggestion is that there could be an abolitionist church that is actually engaged in that kind of Ruth Wilson Gilmore listening synodal project. But to the extent that the church finds itself unable to do that, it must abolish itself, which gets to the fundament of your question. That the one thing that we can't continue to participate in is the reproduction of violence that has been the 2,000-year project of the church. The reproduction of the culture of death has to end one way or another. And I don't know what that looks like, but I know that I am trying not to participate in the reproduction of a culture of death, even as I understand that I am in a state of ambient violence. To the extent that no one is currently doing violence to me right now, that doesn't mean that here on the south side of Chicago, my neighbors are not experiencing violence. So it's here, I'm just sheltered from it. And so I constantly have to be aware of that as well, that we're not trying to talk about some magical island where a certain group of people gets to no longer, be beset by violence. Instead, as you kind of said, the Bonhoeffer thing, I have to find ways to experience more deeply the ambient violence around me, so I understand what's at stake in the abolition that I'm talking about. Because for some people, the solution to the ambient violence and the most logical thing that they could want is to jail the bad people. Right. And so if I can't be in dialogue about that with my neighbors, then I'm just being a utopian. But I'm trying not to be a utopian here. I'm trying to be very kind of practical about this. But in being practical and material about this, I can't impose a particular solution. I have to be willing to be part of the messy, annoying, really frustrating, inefficient dialogue by which we build new worlds. Yeah.
And it's hard. I mean, I don't know if you and I have talked about this, but the book that I thought I would have done this spring, now I'm telling myself I've chosen to narrate it as the book that I am aiming to finish this fall. Is one I've been working on for about 2 years now, but it's simply called How Not to Give Up. And
I love that title. I need that book. Well, finish that book.
Believe me, the problem with it is when I sit down to write it, I am so convicted by what you're describing as the materiality of ambient violence. And I think, how not to give up. Stop reading books by philosophers. Go feed people, right? So the problem becomes, even the work that, I won't say people like us, people like me, the work that I do, I genuinely, when faced with so much need, so much brokenness, so much just cruelty, which for what it's worth, that's the stuff that shocks me about Trumpism, which again, I want to differentiate from conservatism. I think we need conservatives to make that differentiation so that there is a robust public discourse about conservative versus progressive versus socialist versus all kinds of views of how we get to the work of, let's make sure everybody's got food, right? It might look different politically than I think it should look, as long as we're getting them some food and getting them some health care and making sure that their kids feel comfortable in whatever bathroom they're in, right? Like, for me, I don't care about the policy if those are the things that result. The problem is the sheer egoism that underwrites the cruelty that we are now watching is just so staggering that it takes away the words, right? Because there's no description that is any longer able to gain traction. when we have abandoned any commitment to what Paul Woodruff would call the virtue of reverence. And that's where I think, how do we not give up? I don't know. And so I actually have a draft of a chapter at the very end of the book that I keep talking myself out of including, and I just don't know if it's going to show up. I have a lovely conclusion to the book that is the one I want to publish, which is actually using Maya Angelou and Jim Valvano and bringing them together to talk about what does never, ever give up mean at the level of lived, embodied solidarity. And so there is this, I think, that's the chapter I want to end with. It's the chapter that I feel like I need to end with. I have a draft of another chapter called F It, Just Give Up. And that chapter is the one that I keep thinking, maybe that's the actual advice that is needed, right? Is maybe we have to lose a kind of hope that we continue to let ourselves be enamored by in order to hit the point where what hope now looks like is a different thing, right? And I just don't know what the words are to try to enliven what that hope would be. And that's why the book is not done. I continue to think how arrogant of me to think that I would even have anything to tell people on this front. And yet then I think how absolutely privileged of me to think that I could excuse myself the responsibility of speaking into that space, right? So in solidarity about the lack of answers, which is also, I think, something that matters. And this is where I want to ask you, I'm going to read a quick line from your book. It's one of my favorite lines in the whole book as we bring our conversation to a close. And I should have worn a different hat because of this passage. I had it out to wear and I forgot to. This is the beginning of chapter 5. You say, one of my favorite gospel songs comes from a Washington, D.C. band called the Bad Brains. The song is House of Suffering from their 1986 album, Eye Against Eye. In 2.5 minutes, it acknowledges a sickness and names a diagnosis. The suffering we see all around is not somebody else's fault. It is not caused by a few bad apples. It is a household phenomena passed from parents to children as we continue to turn around and around, looking for someone else to blame. The suffering is not someone else's responsibility. It is everyone's responsibility. It is our responsibility. And part of why I love this is because it resonates. Well, A, the Bad Brains are just freaking awesome. Like, again, I have a Bad Brains hat. I should have worn it. But I love this because it reminds me so deeply of what the philosopher I do a lot of work on, Emmanuel Levinas, says, quoting Dostoevsky. He says, all of us are guilty, all of us in front of everyone, but I more than all the others. And one of the things that I continue to find just so infuriating, and I don't have a good answer for it, and so I will leave this as kind of the last question that I ask you officially before we close out. I think right now, if it is easy enough, which I think it is, to critique the cruelty of Trumpism, the violence of those who are currently in positions of power, the dismissiveness and dehumanization that has become, sadly, so common within even the churches that claim to love the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. One of the things that I think is really, really important is to realize those of us then more on the progressive political side, those of us that would try to stand verbally and vocally and publicly on behalf of the marginal, the oppressed, the poor, the excluded, there can be an unbelievable temptation back to that thing we talked about earlier, smugness. It is just so easy to name ourselves as, but we're not those guys, which then becomes maybe the one of the oldest instances of what gets narrated as sin, which is the question, am I my brother's keeper? So my question to you is, in light of the covert magisterium that you describe, in light of the synodal magisterium you call for, in light of the prophetic voice that you offer to the culture of violence that has now become consistent with what we call Christianity. How is it possible to move forward where the neighbor and the brother that we are called to love and keep is the one we see as the cause so often of the violence in which we are participating? How is it that we not only allow for the voices of those who are saying, but I can't eat, but how is it that we somehow restore the community with the voices that have been saying, I don't care, go get a job? Because that to me is the thing where arguments break down in the face of, but love your neighbor, turn the cheek, go 70 times 7. I think it's easy for those of us on the left to embrace those passages when it comes to, the people that we see as excluded. I think it becomes almost just as easy to say those passages don't apply when it comes to, the actual enemies who deserve to have the door slammed in their face. Like the whole idea becomes we get selective about the application of these unlimited calls for what Derrida would describe as the justice to come. So where then do we go from here when maybe the very ones that you and I wish we could lock up, as it were, locking ups can't be the way we go forward? That puts us back into the very church we want to get out of. How do we offer a hand to the people that are so often suggesting more guns fixes the problem, who suggest healthcare is not only not a right, but it shouldn't be given to people who have skin colors they don't approve of? How is it that we want to say we're done with cages, but yet there's about 40% of our fellow neighbors saying build more cages? What do we do in the face of the call to love our neighbor when our neighbor is an asshole?
Wow. No matter where you go, there you are, as Buckaroo Banzai said. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who has come up a lot in this conversation, has said repeatedly that your innocence will not protect you. So thinking that somehow you're the good guy in the situation is not the answer. It's going to look like walking an extra mile with a soldier. It's going to look like an uncomfortable prayer that you have with God for a person who is declared to be your enemy, and you pray for their well-keeping and their well-being, even though they wish you harm. It's going to look like all the uncomfortable conversations that we very efficiently try and avoid. There is no way forward in this that involves not listening to people.
Yeah.
And I think of, the queer theorist, sometimes referred to as an antisocial theorist, Lee Edelman, in his books Bad Education and I forget the other one that he wrote, but basically, No Future. But basically, he challenges his readers and his listeners again and again to be like, are you imagining a utopia where there are no Republicans?
Yeah.
And yeah. What do you do with the inherent fascism of imagining a utopia where your enemies are somehow silenced or caged or dead? And that's you're right. Not the fascist. How do you not? Right. And so this is I think about this a lot because, I'm no longer in the paradigm of Marxism-Leninism, but Marxism-Leninism has a really elegant solution to this: re-education camps. Right. But that's not an option for me anymore. Agreed. I actually have to find a way to be in the struggle against the violence that is facing all of us. And that means that there will be a reconciliation of lion and lamb. And I cannot imagine what that looks like right now. Yeah. Because when I try and imagine what it looks like, it is very much on the terms that the world has offered me. And this gets back to your earlier observation. So I'm not saying that there's some kind of magical formula that we just enact and now everybody's singing Kumbaya. I think this is going to be messy. It's going to be annoying. And it means finding ways to build relationships with people that are wishing you active harm. And I want to stress that's not always possible. Let me go back
Right.
to something that you said earlier, because you were like, what's the point of writing all of these books and reading all this philosophy if what I'm supposed to do is feed people? Well,
Yeah.
I'm the parent of 2 children on the autism spectrum, and I also am in some way neurospicy myself. And I can't always show up and do the socially appropriate thing if I don't have my special interests to refuel me. And that's very true for my 2 kids as well. They have to find ways to refuel themselves. So I write philosophy, I do theology, I write these books, I read these books because it refuels me so I can show up and feed my neighbor, because I can't consistently feed my neighbor and not burn out. And so for me, it's a both and, not an either or. And that's what I bring. That's what I bring to the campfire. Is I bring a big pot of chili, and I'm going to talk about Derrida and Levinas. That's what I bring to the campfire. and other people are going to bring other things to the campfire that may be more sort of useful in a kind of worldly sense. But what I bring, that's what I bring. But that means that the people around the campfire get a nice hot pot of chili, but I also get a chance to exercise my real desire to go down my rabbit hole and talk about these abstract thinkers. And so I have to do both. And I can't do the one without the other. Oh, you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, you give the tithe of anise and cumin, but you leave off the weightier matters of justice, mercy, and the law. These you should have done and not left the other undone. Me doing philosophy is my tithe of anise and cumin, but I'm also going to do justice, love mercy, and walk with modesty with my God. And so the answer is, there's no way out of this that isn't messy. And there's no way out of this that means that you're not going to have to build relationships with people that you hate and that hate you. And I want to stress again, there are going to be conditions where that's not always possible, and that you are not obligated to sit down like a masochist and undergo torture for the sake of the other. This is not, Levinas is not the Marquis de Sade.
No.
And in that sense, we find our ways to make common cause with the other, and we try and build with the other as much as we can. But this is why, and here's where I differ from a theologian like M. Sean Copeland, although I'm very, very sort of informed by her work. She starts with solidarity. She says this: we have to start with where Jesus started, which is with solidarity with everybody. I don't think that that's possible. We can't build social trust until we actually act in trustworthy ways with each other. So we have to begin the process of actually being trustworthy with one another, patiently, day in, day out, at the times when nobody's watching and it's not flashy. We're showing up with the pot of chili. We're doing what we can. When somebody interrupts us, we actually listen and we respond in a way that actually helps them, and they feel more abundance and they feel more flourishing. That's building over time towards solidarity, but solidarity is the end goal, not the beginning point. And it's not the end goal in Derrida's sense. It's not some horizon to come. I think that we actually can get to solidarity with one another because we can materially care for one another. The great example that I've said in other conversations, I had a conversation, I was in a group talk with an acquaintance who is a member of the Sikh religion, Sikh. And they wear a very unique head garment, which it has a technical name, but in our culture, we'd call it a turban. Somebody asked him, why do you wear that on your head? And he said, I wear this so that when I am in public, if someone is in danger, they know that they can run to me and they will be protected.
Wow.
And that's the kind of basic building of, I'm willing to be interrupted and I will be available for your care. And then if that person can consistently do that over time, that begins to build the social trust that leads to solidarity. That's not some VN. That's not some horizon to come that we never reach. Right. That's somebody really feeling like I was in danger and I was helped. I wish that the cross functioned that way.
Yeah.
But right now it does not.
Wow. I think that's such a powerful concluding statement, and I think it gives a wonderful sense to everybody exactly sort of where your heart is. And because I think it's important for, like you said earlier, we're 2 white guys with PhDs, and we're cisgendered and heteronormative. Like, all these things are part of who we are, and that doesn't mean that our vision of the world is one where we just get reinforced, right? There can be conversations between people who look and present and navigate the world in the sorts of bodies that we perform, and say, maybe, our perspective is not the perspective any more than the Bible I have in my book bag is the Bible. right? And that distinction is one that the Covert Magisterium does a wonderful job of laying out. So before we close out, I have a few questions just because of our campfire brand here at Campfire Philosophy.
Bring it.
A couple questions to end out, from the sublime to the ridiculous, or the prophetic to the radically mundane. So at the campfire, Dr. Dault, are you a tea, coffee, or hot chocolate man?
Oh, I'm a coffee person. Definitely. I had the opportunity. I was a caretaker for a traumatically brain injured person way back when I first got out of college. And through a strange turn of events, we ended up, he and I, riding mules down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And at the end of the day, when we got down to the little lodge down there, I had the best cup of coffee I've ever had. So any long day of hiking or trail riding or anything, it ends with a good cup of coffee for me.
Well, I respect that more than I can say, and I will continue to condemn it as absolute heresy, because the only real answer is hot chocolate when around a campfire, and everywhere else in life, the only answer is tea, because coffee is a vile, vile bean. What is your favorite campfire food?
That's a great question. Because I worked for the North Carolina Outward Bound School, I developed a real love for gorp, which is good old raisins and peanuts, which is the kind of trail mix that you carry along with you. But that's more for the trail, and as you're kind of fueling during the hike. I think when we actually get to a campsite, a good way of going with coffee in the morning, at least if we're talking about being around the campfire in the morning, it would be, to the extent that we can do it, kind of griddle cakes and scrambled eggs.
Oh, and that, all in on that, but with some hot chocolate instead of coffee. You find yourself at the campfire, and you or someone else is the annoying fool who thought, on this 15-mile hike, I should bring a guitar. And so you are sitting around the campfire. They pull out the guitar. What's the song you request be played sitting by the campfire, drinking your coffee in the evening?
This Land Is Your Land.
No,
that's one that everybody knows, but nobody knows, because they've all sung it, but they've never really paid attention to the words of it. And when they actually stop and pay attention to the words, especially if somebody knows like the third and fourth verses, it gets really good at that point.
I love that answer. I actually teach a course every once in a while called The Rhythm of Justice.
Yeah.
And what we do is look at different musical genres. And so I do, and then talk about political philosophy and kind of how these different genres illustrate different political ideas. And so one of my favorite sections, other than punk feminism, which is absolutely so fun, all the Riot Girl stuff and up to like Lambrini Girls and things now, but is the folk socialism section. Yeah. And so, yeah, I'm all in with that answer. So last question then, alive or dead, which philosopher or theologian do you go camping with?
Oh, that assumes that they would want to go camping with me, and I'm not sure that's really the. And are you asking the question, the one that I think would fare the best in the wilderness, or the one that I most want to like talk to on the trail?
The latter. I expect almost all philosophers, by definition, if they are philosophers or theologians, they are likely to stub their toe, like getting out of the truck to start the hike, and then just sit down and talk about, was that rock too big for God to have moved it? So yeah, no, this is the conversation on the trail, by the campsite. Who is it you want to have that conversation with, if you could have anybody with you?
Well, I'm lucky in this particular regard, because someone who is both a philosopher and an outdoors person, that would be Kurt Hahn, one of the founders of the Outward Bound movement. And Kurt Hahn was a tremendous educational philosopher, and I have drawn a lot on his thinking through the years. And like I say, he helped to found the Outward Bound movement. But in addition to that, he also in the process of his career as an educator, he was the headmaster of a school in Britain. I'm sorry, a school. Yeah, it was a school in maybe it was in Switzerland or Germany, I forget which, but called Gordonston. And he basically during the Nazi period, he basically wrote to all of the parents and alumni of the school, and he said, you can have Gordonston or you can have the Fuhrer, you can't have both. Yeah. And so they had to smuggle him out of the country. So a person who was very willing to take moral stands, a person who thought very carefully about the importance of the moral education of youth, and a person who said the wonderful phrase, your disability or your obstacle is your opportunity. And that has become such an important touchstone for me as a person with many disabilities and many obstacles. I have drawn great inspiration from Kurt Hahn. So I would love to go hiking and camping with him because I think it would be a blast and I would learn a ton.
I think that is a lovely answer. I'll have to look more into his work. Sitting right here, right now, having just mentioned her a little while ago, I think I would like to take Maya Angelou with me just because she may have the best laugh that I've ever heard. It fills rooms. I saw her speak, decades ago. And she was old even when I saw her. And she, used a cane to kind of get up on the stage. But when she got behind that thing, like she would tell stories and talk and just cackle. And the whole place was in the sort of palm of her laughter. And so I think there's not enough laughing while hanging out on the trails. And so I think maybe Maya Angelou would be somebody I would like to go camping with today. So, well, David, this has been so much fun. For anybody listening, thank you for hanging out with us today. If you want to find out more about David's work, if you want to invite him to speak, if you'd like to get him to come do a book reading and book discussion, you can find all of that at his website. Here is a link to it. I think it's just daviddault.com, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Correct.
Yep, daviddault.com. Go there, DAULT, and get with him, bring him to your event. He would be fantastic. Also, while you're at it, buy a copy of the Covert Magisterium. For you academics, at least get one ordered for your university library. I recognize when we publish books with academic presses, they tend rarely to be affordable. So this is a good one to charge to your departmental budget. And while you're at it, if you have not already, get subscribed to my Substack at Philosophy in the Wild. I post there twice a week. And conversations like this actually also become video posts there on Substack. And so you'll be basically clued into all the work I'm doing. And especially when some of my new books start making their way into print, that's where all of those announcements will be deployed first. And even my launch teams, people who get to read the book before they get published, all of that gets done there at Philosophy in the Wild on Substack. So go hop over there. Everything on Philosophy in the Wild is free. So I no longer charge any paywall to get access to every bit of my content. That does not mean, however, that I do not welcome and utterly thank you for those of you who can join with me as a paid subscriber. It doesn't get you extra content, but it does certainly go a long way toward helping me continue to do public philosophy. And so I really appreciate all of you who are able to be trail partners with me over there. So David, thank you so much for your time, your energy, your passion, and your commitment to doing good in the world, my friend. Thank you for being here. To all of you, thanks for joining us, and we'll have to do this again soon, my friend.
Thank you, Aaron. Such a joy.
All right. Take care, everybody.